Are you sure you want to know what really happened at 1:14:20? Because once I tell you this story, once you hear about the elegant woman with the pearl brooch who smiled too much, and the guests who checked in but never checked out, you'll never look at a boarding house the same way again. I'm your host here at Dark Chronicles, where we dig deep into the shadows of history to uncover the stories that time tried to bury. If you're the kind of person who lies awake at night wondering about the dark corners of the past, about the mysteries that official records refuse to acknowledge, then you've found your home here. Before we hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, and please, do both, because the algorithm gods demand their tribute, and frankly, so do I want you to do something for me. Drop a comment, and tell me where you're watching from. Are you alone? Are the lights dim? Good. That's exactly how this story should be heard. Tonight I'll tell you exactly what happened in the winter of 1923, in a boarding house that stood like a monument to respectability on the outskirts of Salem, Massachusetts. I'll tell you about Mrs. Eleanor Duvall, a woman whose hospitality knew no bounds, and whose guests experienced a level of service that was quite literally to die for. But before we dive into the heart of this tale, let me paint you a picture of Salem in the night. Picture this. It's December 1923, and Salem, Massachusetts is trying desperately to outrun its reputation. The witch trials are ancient history, or so the respectable citizens tell themselves as they hurry past the old gallows site on winter evenings, their breath misting in the frigid air. But Salem in the 20s was a city caught between worlds. On one hand, you had the new America emerging, jazz music drifting from speakeasy windows, women with bobbed hair and shortened skirts, the electric thrill of the modern age. On the other hand, the old darkness lingered in the colonial architecture, in the narrow streets that seemed to whisper of older, stranger times. Blackwood Avenue sat on the respectable edge of town, where successful merchants and minor industrialists built their homes far enough from the harbor to avoid the smell of fish and tar, but close enough to the town center to maintain their social standing. The houses there were substantial, 3 stories of weathered clapboard and leaded glass windows, with the kind of imposing front porches that suggested their owners were people of consequence. Number 1428 stood at the end of the street, where Blackwood Avenue curved sharply and disappeared into a grove of ancient oaks. It was larger than its neighbors, a Victorian mansion that somehow managed to look both grand and slightly. Maybe it was the way the third-floor windows seemed to watch you as you walked past. Maybe it was how the wraparound porch cast shadows that seemed deeper than they should be, even on sunny days. The house had been built in 1871 by Cornelius Blackwood himself. Yes, the street was named for him, a shipping magnate who'd made his fortune carrying cargo between Salem and the Caribbean. But Cornelius had died in 1919, and his widow had lasted only 6 months before joining him. The house sat empty for 2 years, growing more imposing and mysterious with each passing season. And then, in the spring of 1922, Eleanor Duvall arrived. Now here's where our story really begins, because Eleanor Duvall was the kind of woman who made an impression. She stepped off the Boston and Maine Railroad on a Tuesday morning in May, and by evening, half of Salem's respectable society was talking about her. She was, by all accounts, striking rather than beautiful. Tall, unusually tall for a woman of that era, with steel-grey hair swept into an elegant chignon and eyes the color of winter storms. She dressed impeccably, always in deep blues or blacks, with a single piece of jewelry, a brooch shaped like a lily, carved from what appeared to be mother of pearl but which caught the light in ways that mother of pearl never should. But it wasn't her appearance that made people talk. It was her story. Mrs. Duvall, she told anyone who asked, was recently widowed. Her husband, a professor of archaeology, she said, or sometimes claimed he'd been in maritime insurance, had left her well provided for but utterly alone. She'd come to Salem, she explained with just the right touch of dignified melancholy, because she needed a fresh start somewhere with history, somewhere that understood the weight of the past. The real estate agent who showed her the Blackwood house later said she took one look at the place and smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "This will do perfectly," she'd said, running her gloved hand along the carved banister in the front hall. "Yes, this is exactly the atmosphere." She paid cash, 3 months' rent in advance plus a security deposit that was almost as much as the house was worth. The agent was so stunned he barely managed to ask if she needed reference. "Oh, I think you'll find my references are impeccable," she'd replied, and something in her tone made him decide not to press the issue. By June, she'd transformed the place. Oh, not in any obvious way. The house still looked like the Blackwood mansion from the outside, but there was something different about it now. Timothy's initial assumption was that Mrs. Morrison was some kind of treasure hunter, searching the caves for artifacts or valuables that might have washed ashore from shipwrecks. Marblehead had a long history of maritime disasters, and local children often found interesting things washed up on the beaches. But as months passed, Timothy began to notice patterns that troubled him. Mrs. Morrison's nighttime expeditions always occurred within a few days of her guests' deaths. The timing was too consistent to be coincidental. Then, in the summer of 1931, Timothy made a discovery that changed everything. He'd been exploring a cave system that was accessible only at the lowest tides, working his way deeper into the rock formations than he'd ever gone before. In a chamber that was normally completely submerged, he found bones. At first, he thought they might be from seals or large fish. Marine animals died in the caves all the time, and their remains were often left behind when the tides receded. But these bones were different. They were too large, too uniform, and they were arranged in ways that suggested they'd once been connected by clothing or other materials that had long since rotted away. Timothy Brennan had found the remains of Mrs. Morrison's guests. The boy was intelligent enough to understand what he'd discovered, and intelligent enough to be terrified. He said nothing to his parents, who would have dismissed his story as childish imagination, but he began watching Mrs. Morrison with the intensity of a scientist studying a dangerous specimen. His surveillance confirmed his worst fears. Mrs. Morrison was systematically murdering her guests and disposing of their bodies in the sea cave. Timothy had stumbled onto a killing ground that had been operating for nearly 3 years. The question was, what should he do about it? Morrison was a murderer, but he had no idea how to convince the adults in his life to take him seriously. His parents were working-class people who struggled to make ends meet during the early years of the Great Depression. His father worked at the Marblehead shipyard when there was work to be had, and his mother took in laundry and sewing to supplement their income. They had neither the time nor the inclination to listen to fantastic stories about the respectable widow who lived in the big house on the hill. The local police consisted of a single constable, Officer Murphy, who was more concerned with drunk fishermen and petty theft than with elaborate murder schemes. Murphy knew Timothy as a generally honest boy, who sometimes got into minor trouble for trespassing while exploring the coastline, but he wouldn't have taken seriously any claims about Mrs. Morrison's activities. Timothy considered going to Dr. Wells, who had attended several of Mrs. Morrison's guests in their final illnesses, but the doctor clearly thought highly of Mrs. Morrison and would likely dismiss Timothy's accusations as the product of an overactive imagination. So Timothy did what intelligent children often do when faced with adult problems they can't solve. He began documenting everything he observed, building a case that even adults would have to take seriously. He started a journal, recording the dates and times of Miss Morrison's nighttime expeditions. He noted which guests became ill and when, tracking the progression from health to death with the precision of a medical researcher. He mapped the locations where Mrs. Morrison disposed of bodies, marking each cave and noting the tidal conditions required for access. Most importantly, Timothy began collecting physical evidence. He retrieved fragments of clothing from the caves, pieces of jewelry that had been missed by the tides, personal items that could be traced back to specific individuals. He stored these items in a hidden cache in his family's shed, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture and decay. Timothy's investigation continued for more than a year, during which time 2 more guests died at Mrs. Morrison's establishment. By the fall of 1932, he had assembled a comprehensive record of her activities, dates, methods, locations and physical evidence that proved his accusations beyond reasonable doubt. But he still faced the problem of getting adults to listen to him. The solution came from an unexpected source, Miss Sarah Hutchinson, Marblehead's head librarian, and one of the most respected women in town. Miss Hutchinson had known Timothy since he was old enough to walk to the library by himself. She'd watched him grow from a boy who could barely read picture books into a voracious consumer of everything from adventure novels to scientific journals. She understood that Timothy was exceptional, not just intelligent, but thoughtful and observant in ways that most adults never achieve. When Timothy approached her in November 1932, asking to speak privately about a serious matter, Miss Hutchinson took him seriously from the beginning. Miss Sarah Hutchinson was 63 years old in 1932, a spinster who devoted her life to books and learning, and the quiet satisfaction of helping others discover knowledge. She was also one of the most well-connected women in Marblehead, with correspondence relationships that extended throughout New England and beyond. When Timothy Brennan sat in her office and calmly explained that Mrs. Morrison was murdering her boarders, Miss Hutchinson's first instinct was skepticism. But as the boy presented his evidence, the detailed journal entries, the carefully documented timeline, the physical artifacts he'd recovered from the caves. Her skepticism gave way to horrified belief. "Timothy," she said when he'd finished his presentation, "this is the most extraordinary and terrible thing I've ever heard. If you're right, and I'm becoming convinced that you are, then we're dealing with a woman who's been killing people for years." Miss Hutchinson's advantage over Timothy was that she had both the credibility and the connections to investigate Mrs. Morrison's background thoroughly. She began with the obvious step of contacting librarians in other New England towns, asking discreet questions about whether they'd ever heard of a Mrs. Helen Morrison who'd lived in their communities. The responses were troubling. No one had any record of Helen Morrison before her arrival in Marblehead. More disturbing still, several librarians mentioned cases of missing persons that had occurred in their towns: elderly boarders who'd disappeared without explanation, travelers who'd simply vanished while researching family histories or pursuing other solitary interests. Miss Hutchinson's inquiries eventually reached Miss Dorothy Hartwell, who was now working as a researcher at the Massachusetts Historical Society. When Miss Hutchinson's letter arrived describing a woman named Helen Morrison who ran a boarding house in Marblehead where guests seemed to disappear, Dorothy immediately recognized the pattern. The correspondence between the two women led to a chilling revelation. Helen Morrison and Eleanor Duvall were almost certainly the same person. The methods were identical, the victim profiles matched perfectly, and the timeline suggested that Morrison had taken up her activities immediately after Duvall's release from prison. Dorothy Hartwell contacted Detective Captain Shannon, who was now working for the Massachusetts State Police. Shannon reviewed Timothy's evidence and Miss Hutchinson's research, and he reached the same conclusion that had eluded law enforcement for years. They were dealing with a serial killer who'd been operating for more than a decade. But Shannon faced the same problem that had frustrated him in Salem: how to prove murder without bodies. Timothy's discoveries in the caves were compelling, but the bones he'd found were too degraded to provide definitive identification. Miss Morrison was too careful, too intelligent, and too experienced to leave obvious evidence of her crimes. Shannon needed to catch her in the act. The plan that Shannon, Miss Hutchinson, and Dorothy Hartwell devised was both simple and audacious. They would provide Miss Morrison with the perfect victim, someone who fit all her criteria but who was actually an undercover state police officer. Detective James Sullivan was chosen for the role. At 45 he looked older than his years, with graying hair and the kind of mild, scholarly appearance that would appeal to Mrs. Morrison's sensibilities. More importantly, Sullivan was an experienced undercover operative who'd worked dangerous assignments throughout his career. Creating a believable identity for Sullivan required months of preparation. He became Professor James Whitmore, a recently retired classics teacher from a small college in New Hampshire. Whitmore was researching his family's maritime connections to Marblehead, following up on genealogical leads that had brought him to the North Shore. The identity was supported by carefully planted records, employment history at a real college, whose administrators were secretly cooperating with the investigation, bank accounts with appropriate financial history, and correspondence with fictional family members that established Whitmore's isolated circumstances. In March 1933, Professor Whitmore arrived in Marblehead and began inquiring about lodging. Several townspeople recommended Miss Morrison's establishment, praising both her hospitality and her knowledge of local history. Mrs. Morrison was indeed interested in Professor Whitmore. He fit her preferred victim profile perfectly: elderly, alone, financially secure but not wealthy, and engaged in research that provided a plausible reason for an extended stay. When he appeared at her door with a letter of introduction from the college librarian, she welcomed him warmly. "How delightful to meet a fellow scholar," she said, ushering him into her elegantly appointed parlor. "I do so enjoy the company of educated gentlemen, and your research sounds fascinating. I believe I may have some documents that could be quite helpful to your work." Sullivan settled into his role as Professor Whitmore with practiced ease. He spent his days at the local historical society and maritime museum, pursuing legitimate research that supported his cover story. In the evenings he joined Miss Morrison for dinner and conversation, allowing her to gradually learn about his background, his solitary circumstances, and his supposed vulnerabilities. Mrs. Morrison was clearly evaluating him as a potential victim. Sullivan recognized the signs from his briefings about her previous crimes: the intimate conversations designed to uncover his psychological weaknesses, the casual questions about his family and friends, the growing attention to his health and dietary preferences. But Mrs. Morrison was also being more cautious than she'd been in the past. Perhaps it was intuition, or perhaps she'd simply learned to be more patient with age. She allowed Professor Whitmore to settle into a comfortable routine at her establishment, building trust and dependency before making her move. Sullivan reported regularly to Shannon through carefully arranged signals, a specific arrangement of books on his windowsill, coded messages left at predetermined locations, brief encounters with other undercover officers who posed as tourists or researchers. But as weeks passed without Mrs. Morrison taking any action against Professor Whitmore, Shannon began to worry that their plan might fail. Mrs. Morrison was clearly interested in her new guest, but she seemed content to wait indefinitely before striking. Then, in early May, Mrs. Morrison finally began to make her move. Mrs. Morrison's approach to Professor Whitmore followed the pattern she'd perfected over years of practice, but with subtle refinements that showed how her methods had evolved. She began by expressing concern about his health. Had he been sleeping well? He seemed a bit pale lately. Perhaps the sea air wasn't agreeing with him as well as she'd hoped. Sullivan played his role perfectly, admitting to some fatigue and occasional digestive upset, symptoms that could easily be attributed to the slow-acting poisons that Mrs. Morrison favored. "You must let me take better care of you," she insisted, with the kind of maternal concern that had disarmed so many of her previous victims. "I've had experience nursing people through these sorts of minor ailments. A few changes to your diet, some herbal teas that I prepare myself, and you'll be feeling much better." The herbal teas were Sullivan's first confirmation that Mrs. Morrison was indeed attempting to poison him. He'd been provided with a small device that could detect the presence of various toxins, and the tea tested positive for low levels of digital errors, not enough to cause immediate harm, but sufficient to begin the gradual weakening process that Mrs. Morrison preferred. Sullivan continued to drink the tea, but he was protected by an antidote that he took in carefully timed doses. To Mrs. Morrison, he appeared to be responding to her treatment exactly as her previous victims had, growing weaker and more dependent on her care with each passing day. As his supposed condition worsened, Mrs. Morrison became increasingly attentive. She brought his meals to his room, sat with him during his difficult periods, and positioned herself as his primary source of comfort and support. She also began asking more pointed questions about his affairs. Had he made a will? Did he have any debts that needed settling? Were there people who would need to be notified if something happened to him? "I do hope you won't think me morbid for asking," she said with perfectly calibrated concern, "but in my experience caring for elderly guests, it's important to be prepared for any eventuality. You wouldn't want your affairs to be left in confusion. Well, if your condition should take a turn for the worse." Sullivan played the role of a frightened, confused old man, who was grateful for Mrs. Morrison's practical guidance. He provided her with false information about his finances and personal contacts, all designed to support the investigation while protecting his real identity. By mid-May, Mrs. Morrison was clearly preparing for the final phase of her plan. She began making her preparations with the same careful attention to detail that had served her so well in the past. But this time, Detective Captain Shannon was ready for her. On the night of May 18, 1933, Mrs. Morrison made her final visit to Professor Whitmore's room. Sullivan had been expecting her. For the past week, she'd been increasing the dosage of poison in his food and drink, and she'd begun asking increasingly specific questions about his final wishes and his arrangements for notifying people of his death. All the signs pointed to an imminent climax. Mrs. Morrison entered his room at 2:30 a.m., moving with the quiet confidence of someone who'd performed this ritual many times before. She carried a small tray containing a cup of tea and what appeared to be medication. "Professor Whitmore," she whispered softly, "I've brought you something that will help you sleep more comfortably." Sullivan, feigning weakness and confusion, allowed her to help him sit up in bed. The medication she offered him was almost certainly a fatal dose of whatever poison she'd been using, probably a concentrated digital errors preparation that would cause immediate cardiac arrest. "This will ease your suffering," she said gently, holding the cup to his lips. "You won't feel any more pain." It was exactly the sort of thing she'd probably said to all her victims in their final moments, a combination of mercy and murder that she'd convinced herself was a kindness. But instead of drinking the poisoned medicine, Sullivan suddenly grabbed Miss Morrison's wrist and held it firmly. "I don't think I need any medication tonight, Mrs. Duvall," he said, his voice clear and strong. The use of her real name hit Mrs. Morrison like a physical blow. For a moment her carefully maintained composure cracked, and Sullivan saw something wild and desperate flash in her eyes. "I don't know what you mean," she said, trying to pull away from his grip. "My name is Morrison, and you're clearly delirious from your illness." "Eleanor Duvall," Sullivan continued calmly, "also known as Helen Morrison, also known as a woman who's been murdering boarders for more than 10 years. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of Captain Shannon and his team. They'd been waiting in the house since midnight, positioned to move in as soon as Mrs. Morrison attempted to administer the fatal dose. Mrs. Morrison made one final attempt to maintain her deception. "This is outrageous," she declared, as Shannon entered the room. "This man is clearly suffering from some sort of mental breakdown. I was simply trying to help him with his medication, but the evidence was overwhelming. The poisoned medicine, Sullivan's detailed reports of her methods, the physical evidence from the caves that Timothy Brennan had discovered, all of it combined to create an unassailable case against her." As Shannon placed her under arrest, Mrs. Morrison's mask finally slipped completely. The gracious hostess, the devoted caregiver, the respectable widow, all of it fell away to reveal the calculating killer underneath. "You have no idea what you've done," she said coldly. "Those people were suffering. They were alone, abandoned, facing nothing but decline and death. I gave them peace. I gave them dignity. I gave them release from lives that had become unbearable. You gave them murder," Shannon replied, "and now you're going to pay for it." The trial of Eleanor Duvall, aka Helen Morrison, began in October 1933, and quickly became one of the most sensational criminal cases in Massachusetts history. The press dubbed her the Angel of Death and the Mercy Killer, and newspapers across the country followed every detail of the proceedings. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Morrison, no relation to the defendant's alias, presented a methodical case that traced Mrs. Duvall's criminal career from Salem to Marblehead. They called dozens of witnesses: Timothy Brennan, who testified about his discoveries in the sea caves; Miss Hutchinson, who described her investigation into Mrs. Morrison's background; Dorothy Hartwell, who told the court about her father's disappearance and the death of private investigator Samuel Morrison. Detective Captain Shannon provided detailed testimony about both investigations, carefully laying out the evidence that connected Eleanor Duvall to at least 15 murders over more than a decade. Dr. Wells was forced to admit that he'd never suspected Mrs. Morrison of any wrongdoing, despite the suspicious number of deaths among her guests. The physical evidence was compelling but not overwhelming. The remains found in the caves were too degraded for positive identification, and many of Mrs. Duvall's methods had been designed to mimic natural death. But the pattern was clear, and the circumstantial evidence was devastating. Mrs. Duvall's defense attorney, Charles Pemberton, faced an almost impossible task. His client had been caught in the act of attempting to poison an undercover police officer, and the evidence of her previous crimes was extensive. Pemberton's strategy was to argue that Mrs. Duvall was insane, that years of caring for her dying husband had unhinged her mind, and led her to believe that she was performing acts of mercy rather than murder. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Pemberton argued in his opening statement, "you will hear evidence of terrible crimes, but you will also hear the story of a woman whose mind was broken by grief and trauma. Eleanor Duvall is not a cold-blooded killer, but a deeply disturbed individual who convinced herself that she was ending suffering rather than ending lives." The insanity defense faced a significant obstacle: Mrs. Duvall's own behavior. Her crimes had been carefully planned and methodically executed over many years. She'd shown remarkable cunning in avoiding detection, establishing false identities, and covering her tracks. This was not the behavior of someone who was legally insane. Moreover, Miss Duvall herself undermined her defense with her testimony. She took the stand in her own defense and spoke with chilling calm about her actions. "I regret that the court cannot understand the service I provided," she testified. "Those people were dying already, dying of loneliness, of despair, of the slow decay that comes to all of us eventually. I simply hastened a process that was already inevitable, and I ensured that it was peaceful, rather than prolonged." When the prosecutor asked whether she felt any remorse for her actions, Mrs. Duvall's response sent a chill through the courtroom. "I regret that I was unable to help more people. There is so much suffering in the world, and so few people willing to do what is necessary to end." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts of murder in the first degree. Judge Harrison sentenced Mrs. Duvall to death in the electric chair, a sentence that she received with the same calm composure she'd maintained throughout the trial. "Your Honor," she said when asked if she had any final words, "I hope that someday society will understand that mercy comes in many forms. I am prepared to face whatever consequences you deem appropriate." Eleanor Duvall was executed at Charlestown State Prison on March 15, 1934. She spent her final months on death row, reading classical literature and writing letters to various correspondents, including several criminologists who were studying her case. Her letters, which were later published in a controversial book titled The Mercy Killer's Correspondence, provided insight into the mind of a woman who had convinced herself that murder was a form of compassion. She wrote extensively about her philosophy of death, her belief that suffering was the greatest evil, and her conviction that she had performed a necessary service for society. "Death is not the enemy," she wrote in one letter. "Meaningless suffering is the enemy. A life without purpose, without joy, without hope, that is the true horror. I simply helped people escape from that horror." Even facing execution, Mrs. Duvall maintained that her actions had been justified. She expressed no remorse for her victims, whom she continued to describe as willing recipients of her mercy. Her execution drew protesters on both sides. Some carried signs demanding justice for her victims, while others argued that she was mentally ill and should have been committed to an asylum rather than executed. A small but vocal group even supported her actions, claiming that she'd provided a service to people who were ready to die, but lacked the means to end their suffering. Mrs. Duvall walked to the electric chair with the same dignity she'd maintained throughout her trial. Her final words, according to the prison chaplain, were, "I go to my death knowing that I eased the suffering of many. I hope that history will judge me more kindly than this court has." The execution of Eleanor Duvall marked the end of one of the most disturbing criminal careers in American history, but her story raised questions that continued to haunt those who'd been involved in bringing her to justice. The Duvall case had profound effects on everyone who'd been touched by it. Timothy Brennan, the 12-year-old boy whose observations had helped expose Mrs. Morrison's crimes, grew up to become a police detective himself, specializing in missing persons cases. He later wrote that his childhood encounter with evil had shaped his entire worldview and his commitment to protecting the vulnerable. Miss Sarah Hutchinson continued as Marblehead's head librarian until her retirement, and she established a special collection focused on criminal justice and missing persons cases, feeling that libraries had a responsibility to preserve the stories of those whose voices had been silenced. The collection included extensive files on the Duvall case and similar crime. Dorothy Hartwell never fully recovered from the trauma of her father's disappearance and the revelation of how he'd died. She devoted the remainder of her life to advocating for better procedures for investigating missing persons cases and supporting families of crime victims. The Hartwell Foundation, which she established in 1940, continues to provide resources for families dealing with unsolved disappearances. Detective Captain Shannon was promoted to Chief of Detectives for the Massachusetts State Police, a position he held until his retirement. He became a nationally recognized expert on serial killers and missing persons investigations, consulting on cases throughout the United States. Shannon always maintained that the Duvall case was the most challenging and disturbing of his career. The Blackwood House in Salem was eventually demolished in 1938, 4 years after Mrs. Duvall's execution. The lot remained empty for decades, with local residents claiming that nothing would grow there, and that the ground itself seemed cursed. It wasn't until the 1960s that a new house was finally built on the site. The Morrison House in Marblehead met a similar fate. After Mrs. Duvall's arrest, no one was willing to buy or rent the property. It sat empty for years, gradually falling into decay as weather and vandalism took their toll. Local children claimed it was haunted, and several people reported seeing lights in the windows long after the electricity had been disconnected. The house was finally destroyed by fire in 1941, under circumstances that were never fully explained. Some suspected arson, while others claimed that the fire had started spontaneously. The Marblehead Fire Department's report listed the cause as undetermined, but Fire Chief Murphy noted privately that he'd never seen a house burn with such intensity or resist their efforts to save it so completely. The coastal caves where Mrs. Morrison had disposed of her victims were sealed by the town of Marblehead in 1934, officially for safety reasons but actually to prevent any more gruesome discovery. Over the decades, storm damage and erosion have opened some of these caves again, and occasionally hikers or beachcombers find fragments of bone or cloth that might date back to Mrs. Morrison's activity. The official death toll from Eleanor Duvall's crimes was 15 people, but investigators suspected the actual number was much higher. Her activities in Vermont before moving to Salem were never fully investigated, and there were unexplained disappearances in several New England towns that might have been connected to her travels. As I sit here finishing this story, more than 90 years after Eleanor Duvall's execution, I'm struck by the questions that her case continues to raise. Was she truly insane, as her defense attorney claimed, or was she simply a calculating killer who'd found a way to rationalize murder? Did she genuinely believe she was performing acts of mercy, or was that simply a convenient justification for her crime? The psychiatrists who examined her before trial were divided in their opinions. Some saw evidence of severe mental illness, a woman whose mind had been broken by trauma and grief. Others concluded that she was perfectly sane, but possessed of a moral framework that was fundamentally different from normal human empathy. Dr. William Healy, one of the nation's leading criminal psychiatrists, wrote extensively about the Duvall case in his 1935 book The Individual Delinquent. He concluded that Mrs. Duvall represented a new type of criminal, someone who developed an elaborate philosophical justification for murder that allowed her to see herself as benevolent rather than evil. She is perhaps the most dangerous type of killer, Healy wrote, because she genuinely believes in the righteousness of her actions. This is not someone who kills in passion or for profit, but someone who has convinced herself that murder is a moral imperative. The case also raised troubling questions about society's treatment of the elderly and isolated. Many of Mrs. Duvall's victims were people who'd fallen through the cracks of social support systems, elderly individuals with no close family, travelers far from home, people whose disappearances went unnoticed for months or years. Mrs. Duvall had been able to operate for so long, partly because she targeted people whom society had already forgotten. Their loneliness and isolation made them vulnerable to her manipulations, and their lack of strong social connections meant that their disappearances weren't immediately investigated. The psychological profiles that investigators developed of Mrs. Duvall's victims revealed a pattern of people who were suffering from what we might now recognize as depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions. In the 1920s and 1930s, such conditions were poorly understood and rarely treated. Mrs. Duvall exploited their emotional vulnerabilities just as ruthlessly as she exploited their physical isolation. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case was the revelation of how easily a predator could operate within respectable society. Mrs. Duvall wasn't a skulking criminal operating in society's shadows. She was a pillar of her community, respected and trusted by everyone who knew her. Her crimes were hidden not by stealth but by respectability. The boarding houses she operated were seen as charitable enterprises, providing comfortable accommodations for elderly travelers. Her careful attention to her guests' final days was interpreted as compassionate caregiving rather than calculated murder. Even the deaths themselves were accepted as natural occurrences rather than crime. This ability to hide in plain sight, to use social respectability as camouflage for horrific crimes, became a subject of intense study for criminologists and psychologists. The Duvall case was one of the first to demonstrate how serial killers could operate for years without detection by carefully choosing their victims and methods. So what are we to make of Eleanor Duvall and her house of horrors? How do we process the story of a woman who murdered at least 15 people while convincing herself and nearly everyone around her that she was performing acts of mercy? I think the answer lies in understanding that evil rarely announces itself with obvious signs. Mrs. Duvall wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. She was an intelligent, cultured woman who'd found a way to rationalize the unthinkable. She took genuine human needs, the desire for comfort, understanding and dignity in our final days, and perverted them into instruments of murder. Her victims weren't random strangers but carefully chosen targets who trusted her completely. They died believing that she cared for them, that she was easing their suffering, that she was providing them with the compassion that the world had denied them. The tragedy of the Duvall case isn't just that 15 or more people died, it's that they died believing they were loved by the person who was killing them. This story serves as a reminder that we must be vigilant, not just against obvious threats, but against those who would exploit our deepest human needs for their own dark purposes. Mrs. Duvall succeeded because she understood that people who are lonely, frightened, or suffering will often trust anyone who offers them genuine attention and care. The boarding houses at 1428 Blackwood Avenue and 347 Ocean View Drive are gone now, reduced to empty lots where nothing grows quite right. But the questions they represent remain as relevant today as they were in the 1920s and 1930s. Who among us is vulnerable? Who among us is isolated enough to disappear without immediate notice? And perhaps most importantly, who among us would recognize a predator wearing the mask of compassion? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're questions we must ask, because somewhere out there, in some respectable house on some quiet street, there might be another Eleanor Duvall offering comfort to the lonely and care to the suffering. And if we're not vigilant, if we don't ask the hard questions, and pay attention to the warning signs, her guests might check in but never check out. The next time you pass a boarding house or a bed and breakfast, the next time you see an elegant older woman tending to her guests with what appears to be genuine compassion, remember the story of Mrs. Duvall. Remember that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like mercy. And that, my friends, is the haunting tale of Eleanor Duvall, and the boarding houses where guests disappeared without a trace. A story of murder disguised as mercy, of evil hidden behind respectability, of the terrible things that can happen when we stop paying attention to the vulnerable among us. I hope you found this journey into the dark corners of history as fascinating as I did. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of New England's most disturbing criminal cases, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. There are so many more shadows to explore, so many more buried secrets to uncover. And here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever stayed in a boarding house or bed and breakfast that gave you an uneasy feeling? Have you ever encountered someone whose kindness felt just a little too perfect, a little too calculated? Drop your stories in the comments below. I read every single one, and some of them might even inspire future episodes. If you're new to Dark Chronicles, welcome to our community of shadow seekers and mystery lovers. We gather here every week to explore the stories that mainstream history prefers to forget. The cases that keep you awake at night wondering what really happened in that house down the street or that hotel you passed on your last road trip. Next week we'll be traveling to the mountains of Vermont to investigate the abandoned sanitarium, where patients checked in with tuberculosis but left with something far more sinister. It's a story involving medical experiments, government cover-ups, and ghostly apparitions that continue to haunt the ruins to this day. Until then, keep your eyes open, trust your instincts, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who offer us exactly what we think we need. Sweet dreams. Something that made people linger when they walked past. Something that made them wonder what it would be like to step through that imposing front door. And that, my friends, was exactly what Mrs. Duvall was counting on. Mrs. Duvall announced her intentions to turn the mansion into a boarding house in July, placing a tasteful advertisement in the Salem Evening News. Distinguished lodging for discerning individuals. Blackwood House offers elegant accommodations, exceptional meals, and the finest in personal service. Apply in person. References required. Now you have to understand, this wasn't your typical boarding house advertisement. In 1923, boarding houses were generally seen as slightly shabby affairs, places for traveling salesmen and spinster school teachers and people who couldn't quite afford their own apartments. But Mrs. Duvall was positioning her establishment as something different entirely, something exclusive, and it worked. Her first tenant was a Mr. Charles Hartwell, a Boston banker who'd come to Salem on extended business. Hartwell was precisely the sort of man who appreciated quality, expensive suits, handmade shoes, a gold pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather. He took the best room on the second floor, with its view of Salem Harbor and its private sitting area. Mrs. Duvall runs an exceptional establishment, he wrote to his wife after his first week. The attention to detail is remarkable. She somehow anticipates one's needs before one even realizes them oneself. The meals are extraordinary. I've never tasted anything quite like her evening soups. And the other guests are quite fascinating. There's a writer from New York, a lady archaeologist from Philadelphia, and a gentleman who I believe is involved in some sort of import business. Stimulating company, all of them. That letter, incidentally, was found among Hartwell's effects at his Boston home. It was dated August 5th. The interesting thing is that Hartwell's business in Salem was supposed to conclude by August 20th. His wife expected him home by the weekend. He never arrived. When she telegraphed Mrs. Duvall in concern, the response was prompt and sympathetic. Mr. Hartwell extended his stay indefinitely, seemed quite taken with Salem's charms. We'll have him contact you soon. But he never did. Now here's where you might be thinking, well, maybe Hartwell just decided to extend his business trip. Maybe he was having an affair. Maybe he'd simply fallen in love with Salem and decided to start a new life. These things happened, especially in the 1920s when it was easier for people to simply disappear. But Hartwell wasn't the only one. Miss Vivian Ashford arrived in September. She was researching a book about colonial American witchcraft. Ironic, really, that she'd chosen Salem and had planned to stay for 2 weeks while she examined records at the Essex Institute. A precise scholarly woman with a passion for historical accuracy and a habit of writing detailed letters to her sister in Philadelphia every 3 days. The letters stopped after October 5th. Then there was Marcus Webb, a physician from Hartwood, who'd come to Salem for what he described as a rest cure after a difficult year treating influenza patients. He'd booked a room for 1 month, November 1st through 30th. December came and went. Webb's colleagues in Hartwood grew concerned when he failed to return to his practice. They contacted the Salem police, who paid a visit to 1428 Blackwood Avenue. Miss Duvall received them graciously in her elegantly appointed parlor, serving tea from delicate china cups and expressing her deep concern for Dr. Webb's well-being. "I'm afraid the poor man suffered some sort of breakdown," she explained, her voice heavy with regret. "He became quite agitated in his final weeks here, talking about strange dreams, and insisting that he needed to understand the truth about something. I tried to convince him to see another physician, but he refused. One morning in early December, I found a note saying he'd decided to travel west, California I believe, for his health. He left that very day, taking nothing but a small suitcase." The police found this explanation perfectly reasonable. After all, it wasn't unusual for people suffering from nervous exhaustion to make sudden dramatic changes in their lives. Dr. Webb's room showed no signs of struggle, his belongings were gone, and Mrs. Duvall was clearly a respectable woman running a respectable establishment. Case closed. But here's what the police didn't know. Dr. Webb's belongings weren't gone. They were carefully stored in the locked room, on the third floor that Mrs. Duvall had converted into what she called her memory closet. Hartwell's expensive suits hung there too, along with Miss Ashford's research notes, and her half-finished manuscript about Salem's dark history. And that was just the beginning. You see, Mrs. Duvall had developed what you might call a system. It was elegant in its simplicity, terrifying in its effectiveness. She was extraordinarily selective about her guests. Not just anyone could secure a room at 1428. She required references, but more than that, she seemed to have an uncanny ability to identify exactly the right sort of person. Travelers, who were between situations, people who wouldn't be immediately missed, individuals who were already somewhat isolated from their normal social connections. Take Professor Edmund Thorne, who arrived in January 1924. He was a linguist from Yale, who'd taken a sabbatical to work on a translation of certain obscure medieval texts. A bachelor recently retired, with no close family and colleagues, who were accustomed to his long periods of scholarly isolation. Perfect. Or Mrs. Catherine Morrison, who came in February. A widow herself, she'd been traveling extensively since her husband's death, staying in hotels and boarding houses across New England, while she decided where to settle permanently. Her few remaining friends were used to months passing between her letters. Miss Duvall had a gift for making these people feel special, chosen. She would engage them in deep conversations about their interests, their hopes, their fears. She created an atmosphere of intimacy and understanding that many of her guests had never experienced before. "It's as if she sees into my very soul," Professor Thorne wrote in his journal. "She understands my work in ways that my colleagues never have. Last night she showed me some manuscripts from her late husband's collection, texts I've never seen before, written in dialects I can barely recognize. The research possibilities are extraordinary. I may need to extend my stay considerably." He did extend his stay, indefinite. The pattern was always the same. First, the guests would be charmed by Mrs. Duvall's exceptional hospitality. Then they would become fascinated by some aspect of her household, her library, her collection of artifacts, her knowledge of obscure historical subjects. They would decide to stay longer than planned. They would write fewer letters home, make fewer telephone calls, and finally, they would simply fade away. Or, there would be explanations, a note saying they'd decided to travel abroad, a message claiming they'd moved to California for their health, a story about a sudden opportunity that required immediate departure. Mrs. Duvall was always helpful in communicating these explanations to worried relatives and friends, but the guests themselves were never seen again. Now you might wonder, didn't anyone in the house notice what was happening? What about servants, cleaning staff, delivery people? This is where Mrs. Duvall's genius truly revealed itself. She ran the boarding house almost entirely by herself. No permanent staff, no regular cleaning service. She did hire temporary help occasionally, a local girl to assist with laundry, a handyman for repairs, but never the same person twice, and never anyone who would have reason to pay close attention to the comings and goings of guests. But people talk, especially in a town like Salem, and by the spring of 1924, there were whispers. Mary O'Brien, who'd been hired to help with spring cleaning, later told her friends that the house felt wrong somehow. "Too quiet," she said. Miss Duvall told me there were 6 guests staying there, but I never saw hide nor hair of any of them, not a sound from their rooms, not a dish out of place in the kitchen besides what she used herself. It was like cleaning a house full of ghosts. Tommy Brennan, who delivered groceries, noticed that Mrs. Duvall's orders were oddly consistent. Week after week she ordered exactly the same amounts of food, enough for one person, maybe 2 at most. This for a woman who claimed to be running a busy boarding house. And then there was Father McKenna, from St. Mary's Catholic Church. He'd made pastoral calls on Mrs. Duvall several times, as he did with all new residents of his parish. She received him politely but coolly, and he noticed something that troubled him deeply. The house felt empty, he later told the bishop. Not just quiet, empty, as if it were missing something essential. And Mrs. Duvall herself, there was something about her that made me uneasy. When I offered to pray with her, she smiled in a way that was almost as if she found the very idea of prayer quaint. Father McKenna tried to make follow-up visits, but Mrs. Duvall was always mysteriously unavailable. The first serious inquiry into Miss Duvall's boarding house came in April 1924, and it came from an unexpected source, Miss Dorothy Hartwell, Charles Hartwell's daughter. Miss Hartwell was not the sort of woman to be easily dismissed. A suffragette, who'd fought for women's right to vote, a graduate of Radcliffe College, and a secretary at a Boston law firm, she had both the intelligence and the resources to pursue her concerns about her father's disappearance. She'd grown increasingly suspicious as the months passed without any direct communication from her father. Yes, there had been messages relayed through Mrs. Duvall, brief notes claiming he was well and busy, promises that he would write soon, but nothing in his own hand, nothing with his characteristic turns of phrase. So Miss Hartwell took the train to Salem. She arrived unannounced at 1428 Blackwood Avenue on a grey Thursday morning in April, and her first impression of Mrs. Duvall was decidedly mixed. She was the picture of respectability, Dorothy Hartwell later wrote in her journal, elegantly dressed, well-spoken, with the sort of refined manners that would have impressed Mother enormously, but there was something underneath that polish, something cold and calculating, that made my skin crawl. Mrs. Duvall was of course deeply sympathetic to Miss Hartwell's concern. Her father, she explained, had indeed extended his stay several times, becoming quite involved in researching some local maritime investment opportunities, but he'd left Salem just the week before, traveling to New York to pursue a business lead. "I'm so sorry you missed him, my dear," Mrs. Duvall said, pouring tea in her perfectly appointed parlor. "He spoke of you often, such pride in his voice whenever he mentioned your accomplishments. It was a masterful performance." But Dorothy Hartwell wasn't convinced. She asked to see her father's room, and Mrs. Duvall obliged, leading her to the spacious second-floor suite where Charles Hartwell had supposedly spent 8 months. The room was immaculate, too immaculate. It looked like a hotel room that had never been occupied, clean, sterile, with no trace of personal habitation. No book left open on the nightstand, no pen lying on the desk, no impression in the pillow or wear marks on the chair, nothing to suggest that anyone had ever lived there. "Father always left traces wherever he stayed," Dorothy wrote. "His reading glasses on the bedside table, his shaving brush slightly out of place, papers scattered on any available surface. This room looked like a stage set." She pressed Mrs. Duvall for more details about her father's departure. Which train had he taken? Which hotel was he staying at in New York? How could she contact him directly? Mrs. Duvall's answers were vague, but plausible. She'd driven him to the station herself, but hadn't paid attention to which train he'd boarded. He'd mentioned planning to stay at the Astor Hotel, but she wasn't certain. He'd said he would telegraph his new address once he was set. Dorothy Hartwell left Salem that afternoon, but she wasn't finished with Mrs. Duvall, not by a long shot. Miss Hartwell hired a private investigator, a man named Samuel Morrison, who specialized in missing persons cases. Morrison was a former Boston police detective, with a reputation for thoroughness and discretion. More importantly, he wasn't the sort of man to be charmed by Mrs. Duvall's elegant manner. Morrison's investigation began in late April 1924, and what he uncovered should have sent him straight to the police. The fact that it didn't, well, that's a story we'll come to. First, Morrison checked the obvious things. Had Charles Hartwell ever checked into the Astor Hotel in New York? No record of him. Had he purchased a train ticket from Salem to New York on the date Mrs. Duvall claimed? The station master had no recollection, and ticket records from that period weren't preserved, but Morrison was thorough. He traced Hartwell's banking records and found something interesting. The man's account had been untouched since mid-August 1923, no withdrawals, no transfers, no activity of any kind. For a man who was supposedly pursuing new business opportunities, Charles Hartwell was remarkably uninterested in accessing his money. Next, Morrison looked into Mrs. Duvall's other guests. He contacted Professor Thorne's department at Yale and learned that the professor had requested an extension of his sabbatical, but the request had come in the form of a typed letter, not Thorne's usual handwritten notes. Miss Morrison's few friends had received similar typed communications explaining her extended travels. The pattern was clear to Morrison. Someone was impersonating these missing people in their communications with the outside world, and that someone had access to enough personal information to make the impersonations believable. Morrison's next step was to investigate Mrs. Duvall herself. This proved surprisingly difficult. Her story about being a professor's widow was almost impossible to verify. She claimed her husband had taught at various small colleges throughout New England, but record-keeping at such institutions was often spotty. Her references were impeccable but vague. Former neighbors who remembered her as a lovely, quiet woman, but who couldn't provide many specific details about her life. It was as if Eleanor Duvall had materialized from thin air in the spring of... But Morrison was persistent, and eventually he found something. In the records of a small college in Vermont, he discovered mention of a Professor Harold Duvall who had indeed taught archaeology there from... The records noted that Professor Duvall had died suddenly in the winter of 1921, survived by his wife Eleanor. But when Morrison contacted the college directly, he learned something disturbing. Professor Duvall's death hadn't been sudden at all. He'd suffered from a long, debilitating illness, an illness that had left him bedridden and requiring constant care for months before his death. The college's bursar, an elderly man with an excellent memory, recalled the situation vividly. "Poor Mrs. Duvall," he told Morrison. "She devoted herself entirely to caring for her husband, barely left his side for months. When he finally passed, she seemed different, harder, somehow, as if the experience had changed something fundamental about her." The bursar also mentioned something else. Professor Duvall had been working on a book about death customs in medieval Europe, with particular focus on preservation techniques and burial practices. After his death, his research materials had disappeared. Mrs. Duvall claimed she donated them to a museum, but no museum had any record of receiving such a collection. Morrison filed his report with Dorothy Hartwell in early May 1924. His conclusion was carefully worded but clear. Mrs. Duvall was almost certainly responsible for her father's disappearance, and probably for the disappearance of her other guests as well. However, Morrison wrote, proving this will be extremely difficult. She is intelligent, careful, and has had months to cover her track. Moreover, without bodies it will be nearly impossible to convince the authorities that any crimes have been committed. Morrison's report included a recommendation that Dorothy Hartwell contact the Salem police immediately and demand a thorough investigation of the boarding house. She never got the chance. 3 days after Morrison submitted his report, he was found dead in his Boston office, apparently from a heart attack. He was 42 years old and had been in perfect health. Now I know what you're thinking. A perfectly healthy man dying of a sudden heart attack, just after uncovering evidence of multiple disappearances. That's either an extraordinary coincidence or something much more sinister. Morrison's physician was puzzled by the death. The detective showed no signs of heart disease, no family history of cardiac problems, no indication of the lifestyle factors that typically led to such sudden cardiac events, but the symptoms were consistent with heart failure, and without reason to suspect foul play. No autopsy was performed. Morrison's body was cremated 2 days later, at the request of his widow. Any evidence of what might have actually killed him went up in smoke. But Morrison's death wasn't the coincidence it appeared to be. Mrs. Duvall had been aware of his investigation from almost the beginning. You see, one of the references she'd provided when she first rented the Blackwood house was a Mrs. Abigail Morrison, Samuel Morrison's own mother, who had indeed known Mrs. Duvall during her time in Vermont. Mrs. Morrison was a kindly woman who thought well of everyone, and saw no harm in answering a few questions when a well-dressed lady called to ask about her son's business. Had he taken on any interesting cases lately? Was he investigating anything particularly challenging? Such innocent questions asked with such genuine concern for the young man's welfare. Mrs. Duvall learned everything she needed to know about Morrison's investigation, and she acted with her characteristic efficiency. You see, during her months caring for her dying husband, Eleanor Duvall had become quite knowledgeable about pharmaceuticals. Professor Duvall's illness had required a complex regimen of medications, and Eleanor had taken over the responsibility of managing his treatment. When it became clear that hired nurses were inadequate, she'd learned about dosages and interactions, about which combinations of medicines could ease suffering and which could cause other effects. She'd become particularly interested in digitalis compounds, derived from foxglove plants and commonly used to treat heart conditions. In therapeutic doses, digitalis could regulate an irregular heartbeat and strengthen cardiac function. In larger doses, it could cause nausea, visual disturbances, and confusion. In much larger doses, it could cause cardiac arrest that would be virtually indistinguishable from natural heart failure. Digitalis was also readily available to anyone who knew where to look. Foxglove grew wild throughout New England, and extracting the active compounds required only basic knowledge of chemistry, knowledge that the widow of an archaeology professor might reasonably have acquired. Morrison's death was a masterpiece of misdirection. Duvall had visited Boston the day before his death, ostensibly to shop and attend a lecture at the Natural History Museum. She'd taken tea at a hotel near Morrison's office building, had dinner at a respectable restaurant, and taken the evening train back to Salem. She had receipts for everything, witnesses who remembered her, a perfect alibi. What nobody knew was that she'd also made a brief visit to Morrison's office building, where she'd convinced the cleaning lady to let her leave a small gift for the detective. A bottle of expensive brandy, she said, from a grateful client who preferred to remain anonymous. Morrison found the brandy on his desk the next morning. After a long day of writing reports, he'd poured himself a drink to unwind. Just one drink from a bottle that had been treated with a carefully measured dose of concentrated digitalis extract. By the time his secretary found him the next morning, Morrison was beyond help. The empty glass sat on his desk, still holding the faint scent of fine brandy and something else, something floral and bitter that no one thought to identify. Morrison's death should have ended the investigation into Mrs. Duvall's boarding house. Dorothy Hartwell was devastated by the loss of the only person who'd taken her seriously, and she lacked the resources to hire another investigator. The Salem police had no reason to suspect that Morrison's death was connected to anything that might be happening in their jurisdiction. But Mrs. Duvall had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated the power of family connection. Dorothy Hartwell's uncle, Judge William Hartwell, was a prominent figure in Boston legal circles, and a man who'd accumulated considerable influence during his decades on the bench. When his niece told him about her father's disappearance and the suspicious death of the investigator, Judge Hartwell took action. He couldn't officially involve the courts. There was no evidence of a crime, and missing persons cases fell under police jurisdiction rather than judicial authority. But Judge Hartwell had friends in many places, including the Massachusetts State Police. In June 1924, Detective Lieutenant Robert Shannon received unofficial orders to look into the situation in Salem. Shannon was told to be discreet. This was a family favor, not an official investigation, but to be thorough. Shannon was everything that Morrison had been, but with the added advantage of official police authority. He could compel cooperation, access records that had been closed to a private investigator, and ask questions that civilians couldn't ask. His investigation began with Miss Duvall's financial records. The woman claimed to be running a boarding house, but her bank deposits told a different story. Instead of the steady stream of rental payments you'd expect from a legitimate business, her account showed large, irregular deposits, amounts that suggested she was liquidating valuable assets rather than collecting rent. Shannon traced these deposits and made a disturbing discovery. Miss Duvall had been systematically selling her missing guests' possessions. Charles Hartwell's gold pocket watch had been sold to a jewelry shop in Boston. Professor Thorne's rare books had been quietly auctioned through a dealer in New York. Webb's medical instruments had been sold to a pawn shop in Providence. The pattern was always the same. Mrs. Duvall would appear at these establishments as the representative of a client who wished to remain anonymous, usually claiming to be settling an estate or helping someone who needed to liquidate assets quickly. She had proper bills of sale, signed by the supposed owners, and her manner was so respectable that no one questioned the transactions. But Shannon was able to trace enough of these sales to establish a clear timeline. The belongings of Miss Duvall's guests were being sold within weeks of their supposed departures from Salem, hardly the behavior of people who were simply traveling elsewhere. Shannon's next step was to examine the Blackwood house itself. This required a search warrant, which Judge Hartwell was able to arrange through his connections. On a rainy morning in July 1924, Shannon and 2 other officers arrived at 1428. Duvall received them with her usual gracious manner, expressing shock and concern that anyone might suspect her of wrongdoing. She cooperated fully with the search, offering to show the officers through every room in the house. "I run a respectable establishment," she told Shannon. "If any of my former guests have gotten themselves into trouble elsewhere, I'm certainly willing to help the authorities in any way I can, but I must say, I'm quite hurt that anyone would think I might be involved in whatever it is you're investigating." The first 2 floors of the house revealed nothing suspicious. Mrs. Duvall's own quarters were elegantly appointed but unremarkable. The guest rooms were clean and ready for occupancy, though Shannon noted that they had the same sterile quality that Dorothy Hartwell had observed. It was on the 3rd floor that things became interesting. Duvall had converted most of this space into storage, she explained, keeping linens and seasonal decorations and the various odds and ends that accumulated in any household. But one room at the end of the hall was locked. "I'm afraid I've misplaced the key, Miss," Duvall said when Shannon asked about it. "It's just old furniture and boxes of papers from my late husband's work. Nothing that would interest you, I'm sure." Shannon was sure it would interest him very much indeed. He had the door forced open. The room beyond was like stepping into a museum dedicated to the lives of the missing guests. Their clothing hung neatly on rods along the walls. Charles Hartwell's expensive suits, Professor Thorne's tweed jackets, Dr. Webb's white coat. Personal effects were arranged on shelves with almost reverent care. Spectacles, fountain pens, jewelry, photographs, letters from home. In the center of the room stood a large desk covered with papers, documents that Mrs. Duvall had apparently used to forge her guests' communications with the outside world. There were samples of their handwriting, practice sheets where she'd worked to duplicate their signatures, and drafts of the letters and telegrams she'd sent in their names. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of detailed notes that Mrs. Duvall had made about each guest. These weren't simple records of their stay at the boarding house. They were psychological profiles, intimate observations about her guests' fears, hopes, relationships, and personal histories. "Mr. Hartwell fears being seen as a failure by his daughter," one note read. "Uses this to explain extended absence, pursuing grand business opportunity that will restore her pride in him. Daughter's independent nature means she will not press too hard for details if given plausible explanation." Another note about Professor Thorne. "Deep loneliness masked by scholarly arrogance, has always felt misunderstood by colleagues. Used discovery of rare texts to justify extended stay. Academic isolation means colleagues will not miss him for months." Mrs. Duvall had studied her guests with the intensity of a scientist examining specimens, learning exactly what made them vulnerable and how to exploit those vulnerabilities to cover their disappearances. Shannon arrested Mrs. Duvall on charges of fraud and theft, but even as the handcuffs closed around her wrists, she maintained her composure. "You're making a terrible mistake, detective," she said calmly. "These people all left my establishment of their own free will. If they've abandoned their possessions, that's hardly my fault. And if I've tried to help them by forwarding their messages to worried relatives, I hardly see how that constitutes a crime." She was right, of course. Shannon had evidence of fraud and theft, but no evidence of murder. No bodies, no witnesses to violence, no proof that any of the missing guests had come to harm. Mrs. Duvall was charged, tried, and convicted on the lesser charges. She received a sentence of 5 years in prison, hardly adequate punishment for what Shannon was certain she'd done, but the best the justice system could manage without proof of greater crimes. But Mrs. Duvall's story was far from over. Duvall served her sentence at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution for Women in Framingham. By all accounts, she was a model prisoner, quiet, well-behaved, and helpful to both staff and fellow inmates. She worked in the prison library, where her education and intelligence made her invaluable in helping other prisoners with their correspondence and legal documents. But it was in prison that Mrs. Duvall finally began to tell her story. Not to the authorities. She maintained her innocence throughout her incarceration, but to a fellow prisoner named Margaret Collins. Collins was serving time for poisoning her husband with arsenic, a crime she'd committed after years of physical abuse. She and Mrs. Duvall became close friends, drawn together by their shared intelligence and their mutual understanding of what it meant to be women who'd taken matters into their own hands. In letters that Collins wrote to her sister, letters that were later donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society, She described long conversations with Mrs. Duvall about life, death, and the nature of justice. Eleanor is not the monster the newspapers made her out to be, Collins wrote in 1926. She's a woman who learned that the world shows no mercy to those who play by its rules, so she decided to make her own rules instead. According to Collins, Mrs. Duvall's transformation had begun during her husband's final illness. Professor Duvall's death had been slow and agonizing, and Eleanor had watched helplessly as his body failed, while his mind remained cruelly alert to his suffering. She told me that she begged the doctors to do something, anything to ease his pain or to end it entirely, Collins wrote, but they refused, citing their oaths, and the law and the will of God. So she watched the man she loved die by inches, and she learned that sometimes mercy requires breaking the rules. Mrs. Duvall's first mercy killing had been her husband, a carefully administered overdose of morphine that allowed him to slip peacefully away instead of enduring weeks more of agony. No one suspected. Professor Duvall's death was expected, and Eleanor's grief appeared entirely genuine. But the experience had changed her fundamentally. She'd crossed a line that most people never cross, and having crossed it once, crossing it again became easy. She said that after Harold died, she began to see suffering differently, Collins wrote. Not just physical suffering, but spiritual suffering, loneliness, despair, the quiet desperation of people trapped in lives that brought them no joy. She thought of herself as a kind of angel of mercy, offering release to those who needed it most. The boarding house had been the perfect setup for Mrs. Duvall's twisted concept of mercy. She could identify people who were isolated, unhappy, or struggling with life's burdens. She could offer them comfort, understanding, and ultimately, release from their suffering. Her method was always the same, a gradual introduction of small amounts of poison into their food or drink, just enough to make them feel increasingly ill and weak. As their health declined, she would become more attentive, more caring, positioning herself as their only source of comfort and support. When they were too weak to resist or call for help, she would administer the final fatal dose. She insisted that she was giving them what they truly wanted, Collins wrote. An end to their loneliness, their disappointment, their fear of an uncertain future. She said they all seemed peaceful at the end, grateful even. Mrs. Duvall also revealed the location of her victim's body. The Blackwood house had been built with a large root cellar, accessible through a hidden door in the kitchen pantry. She'd disposed of the bodies there, in a chamber that she'd carefully prepared with lime and other chemicals to accelerate decomposition. Collins urged Mrs. Duvall to confess to the authorities, but she refused. What would be the point? She asked. I'll be in prison for years already. Confessing to murder would only mean I'd never be free again, and there's still so much work to be done. Work to be done, even in prison. Mrs. Duvall was planning her return to her mission of mercy. And to mercy. Mrs. Duvall was released from prison in August 9. She'd served 4 years of her 5-year sentence, earning early release for good behavior and exemplary conduct. She emerged from Framingham as quietly as she'd entered it, slipping away into the crowd at South Station without fanfare or notice. Detective Shannon, who'd been promoted to captain during Mrs. Duvall's incarceration, had kept track of her case and was waiting for her release. He'd arranged for discreet surveillance, hoping to prevent her from resuming whatever activities had led to her guests' disappearances. But Mrs. Duvall had anticipated this. Within hours of her release, she'd disappeared completely. The woman who walked out of prison seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving no trace for Shannon's officers to follow. What Shannon didn't know was that Mrs. Duvall had spent her years in prison doing more than just helping other inmates with their correspondence. She'd been building a network of contacts, women who would be released before her, and who could help establish her new identity in the outside world. Margaret Collins had been released in 1928, and she'd used the year before Mrs. Duvall's freedom to create a new life for her friend. Using forged documents and cash that Collins had hidden before her arrest, she'd established an identity for someone named Mrs. Helen Morrison, a widow from Connecticut, who was looking for a quiet place to settle and perhaps take in a few boarders. By the time Mrs. Duvall walked free, Helen Morrison had already rented a house in the coastal town of Marblehead, just 20 miles from Salem. The house was smaller than the Blackwood mansion, but perfectly suited for Miss Duvall's purposes, isolated, respectable, and with a basement that could be easily modified for her needs. Shannon's surveillance team lost track of Eleanor Duvall within 12 hours of her release. They never connected her to Helen Morrison, and by the time they might have thought to look in Marblehead, it was far too late. Mrs. Duvall, now Mrs. Morrison, had resumed her work. The house at 34-7 Ocean View Drive in Marblehead was everything Mrs. Duvall could have wanted. Built in the 1890s by a sea captain's widow, it sat on a bluff overlooking the harbour, surrounded by wind-twisted pine trees that provided both beauty and privacy. The nearest neighbours were a quarter-mile away, and the sound of waves on the rocks below masked any noise that might carry from within. Mrs. Morrison, as she was now known, presented herself to Marblehead society as a refined widow, seeking peace and quiet after years of caring for an invalid husband. She was selective about her social interactions, cultivating relationships with only the most respectable members of the community: the minister's wife, the doctor's widow, the librarian who'd known everyone in town for 40 years. These women found Mrs. Morrison to be charming company, well-read, and cultured, with fascinating stories about her travels and her late husband's work. She contributed generously to church fundraisers and library improvements, establishing herself as a valued member of the community. When she announced her intention to take in a few select boarders, to ease the loneliness, she explained with just the right touch of wistful melancholy. The ladies of Marblehead thought it was a wonderful idea. Such a lovely woman shouldn't be rattling around in that big house all alone, Mrs. Reverend Patterson told her husband. And she's so particular about her standards. I'm sure she'll only accept the very best sort of people. Mrs. Morrison was indeed particular about her standards. Her first guest was a Mr. George Whitman, a retired accountant from Boston, who'd come to Marblehead to research his family genealogy. A quiet, methodical man with no close relatives, and a modest pension that allowed him to travel slowly through New England, following leads about his ancestors. Mr. Whitman found Mrs. Morrison's establishment to be exactly what he'd hoped for: quiet, comfortable, with excellent meals and a hostess who took genuine interest in his research. When he mentioned that his family records included several sea captains who'd sailed out of Marblehead in the 1700s, Mrs. Morrison was fascinated. "You simply must see the Maritime Museum," she told him. "And I believe I have some old documents in my attic that might interest you. My late husband was quite the collector of historical papers." Mr. Whitman extended his planned 2-week stay to a month, then 2 months. His letters home, typed on Mrs. Morrison's typewriter, since his arthritis made handwriting difficult, spoke of amazing discoveries and research opportunities that would require an indefinite stay in Marblehead. By Christmas 1929, George Whitman was no longer writing letters home at all. Morrison had learned from her mistakes in Salem. She was more careful now, more selective, and infinitely more patient. Where Eleanor Duvall had accumulated guests quickly, building up to 6 or 7 disappearances within 2 years, Helen Morrison took her time. 1 guest per year, sometimes less. Always people who fit her carefully defined criteria: isolated, elderly, financially comfortable but not wealthy enough to warrant attention from banks or lawyers, and suffering from the kind of quiet desperation that made death seem like a mercy rather than a tragedy. Her methods had also evolved. The crude poisoning techniques she'd used in Salem gave way to more sophisticated approaches. Mrs. Morrison had spent her years in prison reading medical texts in the library, learning about anatomy, pharmacology and the subtle ways that human life could be ended without obvious signs of violence. She favored methods that mimicked natural death: heart attacks induced by carefully timed doses of digitize, strokes caused by medications that affected blood pressure, respiratory failure that could be attributed to age or underlying illness. Her victims died peacefully in their beds, with Mrs. Morrison at their side offering comfort and holding their hands as they slipped away. The local doctor, Dr. Benjamin Wells, found Mrs. Morrison to be an exemplary caregiver. When her guests became ill, as they inevitably did, she was attentive and competent, following his instructions precisely, and providing updates on their condition with the thoroughness of a trained nurse. "Mrs. Morrison has a gift for caring for the sick," Dr. Wells told his wife. "Her guests are fortunate to have someone so devoted looking after them in their final days." Dr. Wells never suspected that Mrs. Morrison was orchestrating those final days, with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. The disposal of bodies presented challenges in Marblehead that hadn't existed in Salem. The Blackwood house had sat on a large lot with ancient trees and gardens that concealed any digging. The Ocean View Drive house was more exposed, and the rocky New England soil made burial difficult. But Mrs. Morrison found a solution that was both practical and poetic. Marblehead's coastline was riddled with sea caves, hollowed out by centuries of tidal action. At low tide, many of these caves were accessible on foot, but at high tide they filled completely with seawater. Mrs. Morrison conducted careful reconnaissance of the coastline, mapping the caves and their tidal patterns. She identified several that were large enough to serve her purposes but isolated enough to ensure privacy. Bodies weighted with stones and placed in these caves would be carried out to sea by the tide, leaving no trace behind. It was an almost perfect system. Her guests died natural deaths. Their bodies disappeared without a trace, and Miss Morrison continued to live as a respectable member of Marblehead society. Almost perfect. Mrs. Morrison's undoing came from an unexpected source. A 12-year-old boy named Timothy Brennan, whose family lived in a cottage at the bottom of the bluff below her house. Timothy was one of those children who seemed to notice everything. A quiet, intelligent boy who spent his free time exploring the coastline, collecting shells and studying tide pools and generally observing the natural world around him. He knew every cave, every rock formation, every path along the shore. More importantly, Timothy was a creature of habit. He followed the same routes at the same times each day, walking the beach in the early morning before school and again in the late afternoon when he returned home. This routine made him invisible to most adults, who grew accustomed to seeing him and stopped noticing his presence. But Timothy noticed everything about the adults around him, including the elegant lady who lived in the big house on the bluff. At first he was simply curious about Miss Morrison's nighttime activities. He'd seen her walking the cliff path with a lantern, usually during the new moon when the nights were darkest. She always carried a large bag or satchel, and she always headed toward the same section of coastline, an area where the caves were deepest and most numerous.